The forests in Russia are wide and deep and blue. My great-great-grandmother came from one of those forests, and when I was a child I went perhaps to visit her. And in her little cottage in those forests I met another woman. And this woman was full. She was so steeped in her own existence that it felt as if nothing had been left out. And one evening I asked her how it was that she was so free and yet so here. And she said it hadn't always been like that. And then she told me this story. When my mother turned into a sheep, she said, we were in the woods. One of our flock had slipped out of an open gate on an early morning, and the morning was thick with mist. And we walked through the woods to try and find that sheep, and my mother tripped over a tree root and fell down over rocks and broke her neck. But instead of staying, instead of fading away with her broken body, she opened up doors in time and space that she hadn't known existed, and came into the body of the sheep so that she could stay with me. My sheep mother and I went back to my father, and I told him what had happened, but he didn't believe me. He called men, and they went into the woods, and they spent 3 days searching for the body, and they found nothing, as if it had gone or been taken. A few months later, a woman came into the village whose face at some angles looked like my mother, and my father married her. And she brought into the cottage cruelty and silence and a daughter who didn't speak. I don't need to tell you about the smoke of loneliness that moved up then into my chest, or about the house and how the keeping of it had been my mother and father and I, and now it was just me, or about how my stepmother looked after her silent daughter and gave her all she wanted, and I just became dirtier and dirtier with all of the chores and the ash and the dust. Or how even that wasn't enough, and my stepmother watched me when I slipped out at every moment I could to be in the sheep pen with my mother. And one day she looked at my father and she said, we should kill that black sheep before winter comes. And my father looked at me askance, and he said he'd never forgiven me. My father looked at me askance. He'd never forgiven me for bringing back nonsense in the space of my mother, and he said, yes, perhaps it's best. Or how I went out that night into the sheep pen, and I put my arms around my mother, and I screamed and I howled as if I could break the very barriers of time itself. Or how I heard a footfall then, and I turned and I saw her, the daughter who didn't speak, Riga. But she opened her mouth and she said to me, why do you make that sound? If you cry like that, they will send you away. And I looked at her and I said, tomorrow your mother will kill my mother, and then I will be all alone. And she said, no. They will kill her, but you will not be alone, not if you do what I tell you. Tomorrow they will kill her. They will make stew and soup from her blood and flesh. Eat none of it. But in the evening, when they're sleeping, gather the bones of your mother and bury them in the woods, and then she will stay with you. I wiped my eyes with my greasy hands, and I looked at her and I said, how do you know this? And she said, my mother is a witch, and I am her daughter. So the next day they killed my mother, but I didn't eat any of her flesh or her blood. And in the evening when they were asleep, I knelt on that dusty floor and I sought for all of the bones that they'd thrown on the ground. And Riga knelt with me, and we found together every bone from the smallest to the largest. And then I took those bones into the forest and I buried them. And the next day a sapling grew. And when the moon rounded, a great silver birch. After that, things in the house were different. The next day I sat down at the spinning wheel, and Riga sat down next to me, and began to card the wool, as if from speaking she'd somehow allowed herself to move in the house. And I met her eyes, and we looked at each other. And then in the afternoon, when I took the big wooden bucket and began to wash the clothes, she came and did it with me. And after that, we began to hold the house together, and the hearth brightened a little. And sometimes we even laughed together. And I realized that her eyes were like 2 April moons, and her voice was like a song I'd only just remembered. My stepmother watched us and bided her time. And her time came when there was an invitation to the prince's ball. And of course, you know what happened. She took Riga, she took her to the market, she bought the most expensive clothes that she could with the money from my father's wool, and me she gave nothing. And in the evening, that evening of the ball, she looked at me and she said, "You're too filthy to come to a ball." And then she took barley and she took ash and she mixed them together and she stirred them around with her foot. And she said, "Stay here and separate that barley from the ash. And then when you've done that, you can dance." But Riga said, "No. No, if she has to stay here in the dust, then I will not dance with the nobles or the dukes. If you make her stay here on the floor, then I will crawl underneath the prince's table and I will suck the meat from the bones they throw on the floor." My stepmother said, "You will not, you will dance." They left the house still arguing. But me, I wanted to go to the ball. I went out of that house to my mother's grave, and I knelt down on the soil and I wept. And I wept for so long I could no longer hear the sound of my own tears, only the sound in the leaf above. And then I heard a voice, and the voice said, "Wash yourself on one side of the birch, dry yourself on the second, and dress yourself on the third." So I washed myself in a stream on one side of the birch. I dried myself in the green leaves. And on the third side of the birch there was a dress of white and gold and silver, and a horse, a white horse with a golden mane. And I put on that dress of white and silver. And then I took a branch from the birch tree and I went back to my house and I struck that branch 3 times on the hearth, and the barley and the ash sprung apart from each other. And then I got on the horse and I rode to the ball. And as I was riding, I was thinking about Riga, and I was thinking I would find her and I would tell her that I was okay and that maybe we could dance. But when I got there, I hadn't realized how everyone would stare at me, or how they would part for me, and at the center of that parting would be the prince, and how he walked towards me, and he put out his hand and he asked me to dance. The prince asked me to dance. I looked for Riga, I did, but there were so many people in that ballroom, and I danced with the prince once and then he asked me again. And I danced until I saw the full moon rising above the castle walls. And then I bowed to him and I pulled away, and a golden ring fell from my finger. And as it fell, I thought, she will find it. She will know that I was here and that I was safe. How would she know? She was a witch's daughter. She would know. But when they came back, when I put the dress back to the birch tree and it had sunk into the soil, when they came back, by the hearth I was sitting, and my stepmother said, "Riga danced all night with the prince." And I wanted to say, no, that was me, but I didn't. And I looked at Riga, but she wouldn't meet my eye, and she said nothing. And the next day, it was the same thing. My stepmother poured oats into ash and told me to stay. Riga said that without me she would not dance. I went to the birch tree, I got a dress, and I went to the ball. And again I looked for her, but there was the prince, and the prince asked me to dance. And there was such a look in people's eyes when they looked at me that I hadn't seen since my mother had been alive. And I danced with the prince. And I looked at the way they looked at me, and I danced with that music, and I waited until I saw the moon rising outside the castle walls, and then I bowed to him and I pulled away, and a bangle fell from my wrist, and I thought, she will find it. She will know. The next night, my stepmother poured ash into the milk, and I went to the birch tree. They went to the ball. Again, I dressed in white and silver and gold, and I rode and I danced with the prince. And as I was leaving, a slipper fell from my foot, and I thought, she will find it. She will know that it was okay and she can dance. But of course she didn't find it. It was the prince. The prince went round all the houses looking for me. And when he finally came to our house, my stepmother pushed me into the ashes, and she did something to Riga's foot that made the blood drain from her face, and then she pushed that slipper on to Riga's foot and it fitted. And my stepmother said, she is your bride. After that, everything was a blur. My stepmother was getting things ready for Riga to go, but Riga said something to the prince that I didn't hear, and then we went out into the courtyard. And as they were there on that horse waiting to go, she put out her hand and she pulled me up behind her, and then she said to the prince, go, go. And we left. We rode out of our gate into the path of the forest. And as we were on that forest path, Riga said to the prince, ride, ride, for I am not your bride. By oak and ash and collared dove, behind me sits the girl you love. Ride, ride, for I am not your bride. Behind me sits the girl of ash, and she will wear the bridal sash. Ride, ride on, for my stepmothers would switch us around, and I can change us back. But it's in times of change that she has her greatest power, and she will come after us. Ride on. So we rode on through the forest, and I could hear the stepmother coming after us. But suddenly the earth buckled and broke, and in front of us, where there'd never been before, there was a rushing river. And Riga said to the prince, ride on. And he said, if I ride through that river, we will drown. And Riga said, you must. And then she slipped from the horse's back and she knelt down on the bank of that river. I thought she was going to jump in, but instead her body shifted and changed and stretched, and she turned into a wooden bridge across the river. And the prince and I rode across, and as soon as we were across the river, I turned to slip down from the horse and shake that bridge, shake her back into girl again, but it was gone. There was nothing. No river and no bridge. The prince and I rode to the castle, and the next day we were married. And in the evening he looked at me and he said, your heart is broken. And I said, yes. And he said, I will be kind to you. And I said, yes. And he was kind and he was gentle, but I couldn't be still. And every morning I went to the castle gate and I looked through it. And every morning it was locked until one day it wasn't. And like that sheep, so many moons ago, I slipped from the unlocked gate into the forest. And there in the forest I looked. From dawn until dusk, I looked in every part of the forest for the river and the bridge across it, but it wasn't there. And I ended up at my mother's grave, and I knelt in the earth and I said, Mother, forgive me, for I have danced the wrong dance and I have told the wrong story. And I wept until I could no longer hear the sound of my own tears, only the voice in the leaves above. And the voice said, wash yourself on one side of the tree, dry yourself on the second, and dress yourself on the third. So I washed myself on one side, I dried myself on the second, and on the third there was no dress, there was a skin. And I put that skin on and I felt my body begin to flow and shift and change, and my feet became hoofs and my skin became velvet, and I walked into the forest as a deer. Oh, the bliss to no longer have human skin, to feel the earth beneath my hooves, to feel the moon in my skin. I found a herd. I walked with them. We looked for roots and we looked for shoots. But I was always looking for the bridge across the river that wasn't there. Maybe that was what made me findable, for the prince wanted to find me. He looked everywhere, but he knew it was magic. And he knew that there was only one person he knew of that did magic. He didn't do it lightly. But after 3 moons, he went to that cottage that my stepmother had taken, and he told her what had happened. And in the dark of the moon, when my skin was loose around myself from dreaming, they came with torches and they took my skin from me. And the first thing I knew was the smell of my own skin scorching in their fire. And I stood up and I was naked and I wrapped my arms around myself. And the prince put out his hand to me and he said, "I found you." And I looked behind him to my stepmother and I said, "She will eat me." He said, "No, I will keep you safe." I said, "I do not want you to." And then I changed. I may not have been a witch's daughter, but my mother had been a human, a birch tree and a sheep, and I had change making in my cells. So I changed. I changed to call her. I changed not to a deer, but into the wooden bucket that we'd used to wash the clothes. And I called to her and I said, "Come back." I couldn't hold it. I fell back again to Girl, and the two of them were there waiting. And I changed again to the carding comb that we used to card the wool, and I called to her. And then I fell back again to Girl, and they were waiting. And then I changed again to spinning wheel. And this time I called to her and I said, "I will stay like this. I will stay as a spinning wheel. If you come back from Bridge, be Girl again, be Girl." And I felt something move like the turning of the wheel. And when I stood before them again, I was naked, but this time I didn't care. Because I saw in the direction of the rising sun coming towards us a girl with eyes like 2 April moons and splinters in her hair. And she came towards me and she touched me on my neck. And as she did, my skin again began to shift and change, and my feet became hooves and my skin became velvet. And Riga looked at my stepmother and she said, "In change you have come into her life, and in change you will go out of it. You have no more power over her." And then I looked at my stepmother with the eyes of a deer, and I saw that she was nothing, that what she was had been so long forgotten and scorned, that she had wrapped cruelty and maliciousness and other people's skins around herself so that she would not get lost. But when these were gone, there was nothing left. So it was just Riga and I and the prince in the woods. And the prince looked at me and his eyes were angry, but they were also full of wonder. And I looked at him and I realized that I did love him, and that the story now was his to tell, that maybe he would go back to his castle to find another bride, more beautiful, more suitable, and raise children and wield a kingdom. Or maybe he wouldn't. And maybe in a couple of months he would walk the deer paths into the woods to see what would happen. In that moment he let the anger go from his eyes and bowed to us. And then he left. And Riga put her hand again on my shoulder, and the two of us, woman and deer, walked into the birch trees underneath the full April moon. And when the old woman in the forest had finished telling me that story, she put her hand on my shoulder. And I looked at her and I saw inside her more shapes than I thought was possible to see in any human being. She went back inside and I stayed sitting out underneath the full moon.